Hey everyone, my name is Jack, and I must say that Graham Stephan is wrong about the national debt. Whoa, hot take there, criticizing the god of personal finance himself. Well, to set the record straight, I am a big Graham Stephan fan, so much so that I did a parody of him a few weeks back. Check it out for me, okay? But Graham recently put out a video to try and calm people's fears about the rapidly rising national debt that the US government has been racking up in response to the pandemic and in trying to prop up the struggling economy. If you want to see that whole video that Graham did, I'll go ahead and link it above right now. In the video, Graham treats the GDP of the United States as though it's an asset that the government somehow owns, in a similar way to how a real estate investor might own a property after using debt to invest in it. Measuring the debt against the GDP makes some sense for understanding the scale of that debt, at least between nations, but we have to be careful not to treat the GDP like an asset that an investor would be able to buy or sell. GDP is a semi-vague measure of the total output of the country, not something truly tangible like a piece of real estate or a security. But this is where I start to run into problems with Graham's analogy. He gives an example of someone getting a super low interest rate loan to go buy something like a home. An investor would obviously take a 1% or 2% loan to go invest it, since you can really just make that in a savings account. But extending this analogy to the government does not totally work. The government, when it takes out debt, does not invest it all in hard assets that will produce an obvious return or give it something to liquidate to pay off the debt in a pinch. Most of the debt is used to operate programs like Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid, the military, and plenty of other programs like this lucrative stimulus plan that just went into effect. Not to mention, there are a lot of government salaries to pay, including thousands of bureaucrats. Many of these government programs don't necessarily produce anything tangible or that can be sold for profit for the government. And if they do produce anything, they're typically sold at a loss of sorts for some social benefit, like the post office's services, for example. Now, I'm not going to ignore that some of this spending is useful for spurring consumer spending and investment that will create greater tax revenue elsewhere in the future. So the government definitely will recoup at least some of this money over the long term. How much it will recoup is a very difficult thing to measure, but that's beside the point. Now, Graham does bring up the greater problem that is out-of-control spending with no sign of lowering the perpetual deficits that the government currently faces. And the government will have to pay this off eventually. There are three ways to take care of the national debt, and only three ways. One way is something that Graham explains in his video, and that's raising taxes in the future to pay off the debt. This is fairly straightforward. We spent a lot of money now, and we'll raise new tax revenue to pay for it later. This will hurt output in the future since we'll have to effectively tighten our belts to pay for something that we borrowed a while back. Cutting spending would have a similar effect. Either way, we'd have to make some sort of cut to our incomes, either by reducing government benefits or increasing taxes. This would hurt the economy either way. This concept of the debt cycle is explained really well in Ray Dalio's How the Economic Machine Works, which I've linked above. Definitely check it out. It's a very high-level, well-done video that Ray Dalio and his team put together. The second way is what's going on in a very large way right now. That's right, printing money. In a bizarre twist of fate, the government can actually take out debt by issuing treasury bonds to the public, only to have the Federal Reserve buy much of those low interest rate bonds, which then can print money to pay off the bonds in a weird sort of infinite money hack. So why doesn't the government just do this with all debt? Well, that's what economists like AOC would probably want, but there's this nasty thing called inflation. When a government just prints money out of thin air, money becomes less scarce, so it becomes worth less. The cost of goods rise as more money enters circulation since people technically have more to spend. But they don't have more to spend because they're actually being more productive, they just happen to have more money in their hands. And as things get worse, the printers keep rolling, businesses and consumers may begin to anticipate more inflation and will try to spend all of their money as soon as they get it, since saving would be a waste of time when prices are rising so rapidly. When things get really out of control, hyperinflation occurs. Countries have caused hyperinflation in an effort to pay off huge debts a number of times in the past. Weimar Germany, following the crushing Treaty of Versailles, is a classic example. The German government, after World War I, was forced to pay an exorbitant amount of money to the Allies, mainly France, as punishment for the war. With a weak post-war economy and no solid tax base, the government printed money to pay off the reparations. Chaos followed. Prices doubled every couple of days, and German marks became worth far less than the paper they were printed on. Yes, that is a guy using money as wallpaper, and here's a woman using it to start a fire. Monthly inflation reached something like 30,000% at its peak. As a comparison, the Fed's target inflation rate is around 2% annually, just enough to entice people to spend money rather than hold it in cash over the long term, but definitely not enough to start this dangerous feedback loop and huge instability. But Weimar Germany is nothing compared to some other countries, including present-day Venezuela, which prints money to pay for its massive debt and government programs. No one is sure exactly how high Venezuela's inflation is right now because of how insane it has gotten there. In 2018, the inflation rate was somewhere close to 1,000,000%, and probably somewhere close to 10,000,000% in 2019. Yes, this means that prices in Venezuela rose 100,000 times over just 1 year. Technically, the US government could print everyone $1 million each and make everyone a millionaire almost instantly, but inflation would skyrocket since businesses would just charge more because everyone has more money to spend. In other words, demand would artificially increase, and businesses would recognize this. Being a millionaire in that alternate universe would be meaningless since, well, everyone is a millionaire. It's best summed up by a great philosopher, Syndrome from The Incredibles.
When everyone's super, no one will be.
The third way to eliminate the debt is even more catastrophic, and that's to default.
I declare bankruptcy!
This would be where the government declares bankruptcy and deems the debt unpayable. This would eliminate the debt, but also the US's status as an economic powerhouse in the world while creating other massive problems. All of the investors and governments throughout the world that rely on the stability of the US currency system and US Treasury bonds would be screwed, and that's no good. So at least one of those three things needs to happen at some point: taxes, inflation, or default. Graham suggests that holding onto the debt and letting the normal inflation work its magic over the long term to erode the value of the low interest debt makes the most sense. But the debt still needs to be paid off at some point. Even long-term treasury bonds don't last forever, so the government would need to take on more debt at potentially higher interest rates if it doesn't pay it off by the time the bonds mature, in a sort of way to refinance those bonds. But Graham and I really disagree on whether or not the current national debt situation is actually a big deal. Here's what he had to say.
Now, in terms of whether or not we should be worried about our national debt, the answer is probably not. When we look at our debt in relation to how much money we make, we're actually a lot lower than quite a few other countries. Now, second, I think it's safe to say it's assumed that the plan with this debt is just to keep interest rates low and then let inflation do its thing. As long as our economy continues to grow and innovate, then that debt is just going to be sitting there slowly whittling away with inflation. Assuming, of course, we don't keep adding to it.
One more time.
Assuming, of course, we don't keep adding to it.
That's a pretty hefty assumption to make when government officials are incentivized to favor short-term interests in getting elected over taking care of future generations. No one wants to be the Herbert Hoover who stood by and watched a massive depression hit, or be the George Bush who had to raise taxes to balance the deficit. That's a hard thing to sell to people who want results now. And with outrageous theories like modern monetary theory being supported by an increasing number of politicians, and the political difficulties for both sides to make cuts in spending, it's really hard to imagine balanced budgets happening anytime soon. But let's say Graham's assumption is true, and the deficits stop, and we have a balanced budget every year forever here on out. That definitely would be a good thing. Graham theorizes that taxes will go up at some point to cover the existing debt, which I think he kind of brushes off a little too casually, but it is a valid theory. It's one of the three ways to eliminate debt as a government. But that money has to come from somewhere. That's future money that could be used to fund an educational program, healthcare services, roads, or even just tax cuts to let the people use the money themselves. Instead, the money will have to be sucked out of the economy to pay back whoever holds the US debt. That's no small task when we're talking about a rapidly climbing $25 trillion debt mountain. Even though the US has a lot of wealth, part of that is because it's a business-friendly environment compared to many other countries. Raising taxes would make it less business-friendly, and there's no guarantee that the US would have as strong of a tax base once taxes actually rise to the point that they are no longer comparatively low. And when taxes get too high, individuals and businesses have a massive incentive to avoid taxes and will behave differently, probably not as productively either. This is best illustrated by the Laffer Curve, a simple graph that suggests the same thing. As taxes rise past a certain point, tax revenue will not increase proportionally and will likely decrease instead as people attempt to avoid the taxes, both legally and illegally. Things are going to get ugly if we are ever to pay down this debt. Not only would we have to cut a lot of our current public spending or raise taxes much higher than they currently are, or maybe face some serious inflation instead, it's not as though we'll be getting some real asset in return. The money was spent on a welfare program, a stimulus package, or some other government operation from many years ago, which may or may not have been worth the investment. We don't really know that yet. In short, looking at government debt like a typical investment is overly simplified. The government is not buying trillions of dollars of assets. It's funding operations, which may or may not be profitable. So the money has to come from somewhere, and that's our future selves. Whether that be through direct taxes or through a silent tax via inflation, we will see. And if you guys want to invest in some low-yield U.S. debt, definitely check out my link in the description below for M1 Finance. It's a great platform that I've covered plenty on this channel, and I've got a new episode of my M1 Finance portfolio series coming up on the 15th, just like every month. But you can go buy one of the Treasury bond ETFs so you can ensure that some of the taxes that you eventually have to pay for the debt are paid back to you, the bondholder. That's some savvy right there. It won't yield you much for probably a number of years, but it's a head start on getting your share of the expanding U.S. debt. I'm not a financial advisor, but I am affiliated with M1, so I'd naturally love it if you check them out. Links in the description. Well, that's all I've got for today. If you like this video, like it, since it helps the channel out a lot. If you want more content on personal finance, investing, real estate, and other similar topics, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new updates. I post new videos every single week and wouldn't want you to miss out. What's your hot take on the U.S. national debt? Is it time to get worried? Definitely let me know in the comments below, but until next time, take care.